This week on Money in America, we're going to talk about the recent Supreme Court case of McCutcheon versus the Federal Election Commission, or FEC. The legislative action in question here is the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, or BCRA. The BCRA imposed two limits on campaign finances. The base limit limited how much money one donor could give to a recipient in a two-year election cycle, and the aggregate limit controls the maximum amount of donations that a person can make to all political recipients in a two-year election cycle. McCutcheon challenged this law when he wanted to make a donation that would have been allowed by the base limit, but illegal under the aggregate limit. One thing leading to this case was the start of modern campaign finance laws in the 1970s, which eventually led to the framework of the BCRA that we have today. McCutcheon lost at the district level, but appealed the case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in favor of McCutcheon and held that the government could not limit the aggregate amount that a person could contribute to political recipients. Political contributions are a form of speech because they fund things like television and newspaper ads which express political beliefs. The court agreed with McCutcheon that the aggregate limit prohibited his speech in violation of the First Amendment. Let's meet with Sean McCutcheon to get his take on the situation. Could you give us your take on the situation here, Sean?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Andrew. I'm very happy with the Supreme Court's decision. I thought it was very simple, really. It's supported by the idea that the First Amendment protects political expression. It's also supported by the fact that donating money is a form of political expression, according to a past U.S. Supreme Court case, Buckley v. Vallejo. The First Amendment is meant to prevent the government from being able to limit situations exactly like this one. Because of this case is tied very closely with the Bill of Rights. Let me just say, just because we're talking about the rights of the wealthy doesn't make those rights any less important. We also have seen increased ability to exercise free speech in campaigns recently. For example, in Citizens United versus FEC, the court ruled that the independent campaign spending by corporations could not be limited. I was very happy that the trend continued with this case.
Thanks, Sean. Let's meet with Ann M. Ravel, chair of the FEC, to get her opinion on the Supreme Court's decision. Thanks for agreeing to speak with me, Ann.
Thanks for having me on the show, Andrew.
No problem. So, Ann, what's your take on the recent Supreme Court decision?
Well, I think it's very simple. This case involved executive action because McCutcheon is challenging the actions of the FEC. The aggregate limit that was enforced helped our whole nation, and McCutcheon wanted to take it away to help a very small percentage of the population. Because so few people could afford to get close to the aggregate limit, this regulation imposed a very small burden on free speech. This small infringement on free speech paid for the very important job of preventing corruption in our government. On the other hand, allowing infinite donation allows contributors to hold a bigger role in government, and it would weaken the voice of everyone who wasn't extremely wealthy. Because of this, I disagree with the ruling of the Supreme Court.
Now that we know the facts, let's go to our roundtable discussion regarding whether or not this decision is good for America. Tonight, I'm joined by Dr. Richard Hassan, professor of political science at UC Irvine College of Law, and Sarah M. Schauf, a member of the Committee for Justice. So, what do you guys think about the recent Supreme Court decision?
I think it was a great decision by the court. The majority of Roberts, Scalia, Kennedy, Alito, and Thomas had it right when they said that donating money to candidates was protected by the First Amendment. The Supreme Court had ruled in the past that donations could be limited to prevent corruption or the public perception of corruption in government. The court stated that since it was so important that free speech be protected in a democracy, campaign donations could only be limited to prevent corruption in the form of direct bribery. In the end, the majority decided that the aggregate limits should be overturned because they did not do a good enough job of protecting against corruption. I think that the Supreme Court got it right because we should be very careful about limiting our free speech.
I disagree. I think the dissent had it right when Breyer wrote that the majority's definition of corruption was too narrow. He stated that whenever large amounts of money are involved, corruption is a potential issue. Breyer also wrote that a corrupt government is unable to respond to the free speech of its people, so it's worthwhile to slightly interfere with freedom of speech to prevent corruption. My issue with this decision is that future cases will be bound only to limit the direct exchange of money for political favors. This may lead to more and more corruption being allowed in the future. Because of that, I think the aggregate limits should not have been overturned and that this decision was not in the best interest of America.
Well, it appears we have some very different opinions on the matter. Would either of you like to address the issue of judicial review as a whole in our current Supreme Court?
I think it's concerning that the recent Supreme Court under Justice Roberts has made a lot of 5-4 decisions. These decisions are nearly always split along partisan lines. Recent justices appointed by Republican presidents nearly always vote Republican in close decisions, and the same is true for Democratic appointees. The idea that the Supreme Court is influenced by politics instead of simply doing what is right is quite worrisome, if you ask me.
I'm inclined to agree. Well, since we're about out of time, I'll have to wrap this up. In this edition of Money in America, we've heard arguments from both sides of the Supreme Court's decision on the case of McCutcheon versus the FEC. Based on our discussion, I believe that this decision was not in the best interest of America, since it has the potential to lead to an increase in corruption in government. Furthermore, I'd say that judicial review as a whole may not be good for America, since it has become so closely tied with political parties.